Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bites. Today we'll be looking at tools and processes for engineering teams to record decisions, architectures, and incidents. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bites, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 5,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. Huge thanks to our headline partner, AWS, for helping make these Bite events possible. So today with you, I'm your MC. I'm Glyn Roberts. I'm the CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt. With me today is Evelina Vrabie, if I'm saying that correctly, co-founder and CTO at Touco Lab. Hi, Evelina. Please tell us a short description about yourself.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to my very first CTO Craft panel. In terms of who I am and why I'm here, well, for the last 3 years, I've been starting up. One of my co-founders started Touco, which we rebranded as Touco Lab in 2018, and I joined shortly after. We started as tech for good research about financial products for vulnerable users. We iterated through several commercial propositions, but like many other early stage companies, our business development was frozen on its tracks, mostly by COVID, a little bit by Brexit, and a bit by our own decision making. However, we're happy to have brought hope for our users because we've worked closely with the financial services industry, academia, and the charity sector to champion the need for more inclusive, essential products and services. And that's a good legacy, I think. So if you want to know more about that, my co-founder, Bailey Cursor, has worked with the Money Advice Trust and Fair by Design to publish guidelines on inclusive service design for other firms, possibly for the FCA as well, based on our research. And this report is available on Fair by Design's website.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you here. Also with us today is Fergus Doyle, CTO, consultant and advisor. So welcome, Fergus. Please give us a short intro about yourself.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. I'm an interim and advisory CTO, which means I get exposed to quite a wide variety of teams and their styles towards documentation or lack thereof in certain cases. I'm normally brought in to build the foundations for high-performing teams, and documentation and working practices is very much a part and parcel of that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging into this topic in more detail.
Fantastic. And the last member, but obviously not least, Io James, who's the head of engineering at iTech Media. Welcome, Io. Please also give us a short description.
Thanks, Glyn. So thanks, everybody. I'm really glad to be here as well. This is my first ever panel discussion, so it should be a good one. My role is as a head of engineering at iTech Media. I work within a function called Core Capabilities, which looks after service provision and enablement for the rest of the organization. I have been doing this type of work for about 15 years now, whether it be project management, development, or infrastructure management. And that's a very rough summary of me. In terms of what we do as a business, we work in the iGaming space, so online entertainment and gambling, with a few other niche areas. And we are solving interesting challenges with technology in terms of helping people make smart choices online.
Excellent. So great to have you all here. For the audience, you can ask a question at any time from the Ask a Question link just below the video. So let's talk about how to optimize technical documentation and avoid common pitfalls. So my first question I'll direct at Fergus. What are the most useful and common kinds of technical documents?
So I think in terms of the most common kinds, I'd roughly split it into maybe 3 buckets. So internal technical documentation, internal process documentation, and then external user-facing documentation, which all have quite different characteristics. So internal tech documentation is maybe at the root of it all, code comments and maybe internal API documentation, stuff like architecture diagrams and readmes that you'd have alongside the code. Process documentation is more about artifacts of day-to-day operations, so code reviews, write-ups for retrospectives or postmortems, but then also protocols and playbooks for protocol response to incidents and stuff like that. External user-facing documentation, things like API documentation, product docs, even to a certain extent product marketing and stuff that really outlines the features of the software and the product that you're putting out in front of users. But then also things like compliance and regulatory documentation that might kind of tie into restrictions and requirements that are placed on the software moving forward. In terms of what makes documentation useful, then as a general rule, you want to be able to write once and read many. If you're writing for an audience that isn't going to read the thing, then that's probably not particularly useful documentation. And equally, if your audience is relatively small or kind of a single person, then you're just as well having a conversation with that person rather than writing it down in a format that isn't going to get picked up again and maintained. There's likely to be a kind of maintenance overhead for any documentation that you put out there. Documentation is especially useful for onboarding new starters into the organization, for adjusting the mindset and any sort of kind of transition within the team. Then you've got reference documentation to be able to kind of call back on that, and especially internally, then any sort of interfaces between teams, different areas of the organization, or even like kind of technical components, then kind of interface contract documentation around that is an especially useful discussion point for understanding where things may or may not need to change in reflection to working practices on a day-to-day basis. And then I think another key point there is around tracking decision making and having some sort of audit history of how the software grows organically from what the original intentions are, because inevitably there's only so much context any one person can hold in their head within the team, and obviously as teams grow and change shape, then that context, it can very easily be lost with people leaving the organization or people moving into different areas of the organization where they're maybe less directly involved in some of those areas of what they originally built.
Yeah, absolutely. Startups rarely pay attention to documentation because it's all about feature and deployment, isn't it, in these cases? Evelina, what other aspects are useful when it comes to technical documentation?
I think Fergus has covered the question well. The only other classification I can think of is based on the distance between the documentation and the code itself. So, for example, closest to the code or part of it, we have documentation of classes and functions, depending on the paradigm you use, API definition documents like OpenAPI and RAML, various code comments, README files, ADRs, which are architecture and decision records. Then farther from the code, you have pull requests. And I consider the description of a pull request and the comments that are generated during the code review a form of technical documentation, even though it's a more ephemeral one. And then even farther away in a centralized wiki, you have, like Fergus mentioned, risk assessment documents, pre-mortems, incident responses, post-mortems, technology strategy and forecast documents, onboarding documents, as in explaining how to access, check out, run, deploy a project. And of course, some of them also reside at the code level. And in terms of what makes documentation useful, like Fergus mentioned, there are many benefits, but perhaps the three most surprising ones that I find is that first, it gives us more control and clarity on decision making. Secondly, it removes biases and increases empathy for ourselves and for others. And thirdly, it increases the speed of learning iterations. And you may say, Evelina, you're crazy. How does technical documentation increase empathy? And why do we care about that? And the answer is that when we document, we create traceability for our decision making and an observable learning process, right? And this leads to open, fairer evaluation of ourselves and others. And think about the fact that we humans demand interpretability from machine models. So doesn't it make sense to demand the same from our own decision making to begin with? And that's important because we often judge ourselves and others by outcomes of our decisions, right? What's less visible is that good decisions lead to good outcomes only if we're lucky. So luck plays a really big role in our lives, and not understanding this creates all sorts of biases, like the survivorship bias, the outcome bias, the hindsight bias, etc. And all of these biases decrease empathy, right? So judging others only by outcomes is dangerous because we lack transparency into the effort that was put to gather and analyze the context of a decision. And that's extremely important because the context changes over time, right? So we risk overfitting decision quality to outcome quality. And what that does, it makes us more prone to repeat errors, which, thanks to luck, result in good outcomes. And perhaps avoid good decisions that didn't work out for the same reason, right? But when we have written traces, we get much better visibility into this opaque thinking process. And I think that increases empathy, right? We can see the effort and consideration that was put into that decision. We can provide targeted feedback for each step in that decision, right? And this becomes a repeatable learning process that we can teach others because we cannot teach luck or gut feeling, right? And the opposite of decision-making traceability is black box thinking, right? We know how this happens. We have someone joining a team and declaring out of the blue that we're changing the current architecture, we're migrating to a new framework, etc. And why, right? The answer is in their heads. They hoard the context of the decision and the decision-making steps. And they're walking oracles, right? And when they leave, everyone else is left scrambling to piece together why and how we ended up with a particular situation, architecture, or even company culture, right? So there are many other benefits. And I wrote about them in an article called Asynchronous Communication for Meaningful Decisions, Fair Evaluation, and Fast Learning. And you can find that on my Medium blog.
Excellent. Okay, then. So let's bring IO into the conversation as well. So with documentation, what is the value behind this, would you say?
So for me, there's a number of parts in this, and we've talked a lot about technical side, and obviously as engineers and CTOs, we naturally would, but there's a massive value outside of that as well. So a couple of bits from me on this: speed of decision. Proper documentation will enable you to make fast decisions. And documentation is not just what's written down. It's much broader context than that. So, for example, metrics are a way of documenting performance and a way of documenting what is going on. And by using many data points, we're able to make faster decisions. So, speed of decisions are a really valuable one for me. Speed of onboarding, again, closely linked to speed of decision and looking at how do we accelerate what we do. If people are able to come in to a brand new team or organization and learn what is going on very rapidly, we get much more value from that. We're able to bring them in quicker. We're able to get them using their skills to a much more effective way as quick as possible. And for me, that speed of onboarding is very valuable. Ease of movement across teams as well. So how many times have we had pockets of skill set where we're like, okay, Bob knows that, and we need to now move Bob around the organization to make that work. For me, this is problematic. This is a sign of dysfunction, where we need to start looking at, okay, why is that knowledge a gap across the organization? Why is it difficult for us to be able to make decisions around this? So it's having that holistic view of knowledge across an organization and not just in particular areas. And finally, for me, the biggest value is a lot of what we've talked about so far, which were really great answers, were around very technical documentation. And in essence, for me, there is a value in alignment across the rest of the business in what we're trying to build or what we're trying to do or work towards. So for iTech, we have a sort of Spotify's chapter approach. So we have engineering, product, and delivery. And documentation and technical documentation brings them into alignment. You know, if we're talking about speed of decision, speed of build, and various parts like that, you need alignment across the rest of the organization to be able to fulfill these things at pace. So documentation for me, in terms of value, it also brings alignment across many stakeholders.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we've already got 5 questions in from the audience, so let's just start getting through a couple of those, and then we'll carry on with mine. So let's start off with one from Catlin. What is a lightweight framework? Where's that gone? It's literally just disappeared off my list. There we go. So what is a lightweight framework you've used to capture architecture decisions? Anyone would like to start with that?
Yes, I can start with that. So I mentioned architecture decision records, and you can find many templates for those. But for example, what I found to work is, in terms of the format, I use Markdown, which I think is an excellent markup language for technical documents, and it offers us structure, like thinking structure. It has lists, headers, equation, flowcharts, you name it, depending on the flavor, right? That's a bit of a drawback because not all of them are supported. But how I do this is basically I start with bullet points, right? And then I convert those bullet points to headers like H1, H2. And then I add a table of contents at the top. And as an optional step, something I picked up during my university is I like to rewrite the headers to read like book chapters, because anyone reading the table of contents at the top can pretty much understand 80% of the document at a glance, right? And obviously things like using appropriate markup for code blocks, maybe call-outs or highlighting sentences that need special attention, and obviously making sure that it's readable on smaller screens. But yeah, that's one way of approaching it. Maybe someone else has other ideas.
I'm happy to add a couple of points to that. I mean, I think in general, you know, this falls quite quickly into how you can better asynchronously communicate with the rest of the team, and at the end of the day, that's going to depend on what sort of tools you've got in place to be able to support that, whether that's you know, Slack or email or Google Docs, or you know, having stuff close to the code bases that you're talking about. But I mean, if we're really just looking for independent of those tools, then being able to write up meeting notes or decisions as and when they're being discussed within the team and have that in whatever format is going to work best for being able to refer back to those and kind of continue building the discussion on top of that, then that's very much kind of part and parcel of starting somewhere without necessarily needing to overthink what the process is going to evolve into. I think having some of that content somewhere is going to be strictly better than having it in the pinnacle of a framework that you might evolve towards incrementally as a team.
Excellent. Also, Fergus, so just one of the other questions is, can tests replace internal documentation in your view?
I mean, you get test suites like BDD, Gherkin and Cucumber and stuff, which I think are a step towards trying to bridge that gap between automation of test cases and managing expectations with not only technical team members but also the wider business. I mean, I'm a strong believer that there's no, you can't get away with just like one form of technical documentation, right? There's multiple different sources of information, and there's better ways of capturing that information in different parts of the business and in different tools. So I think in certain cases then testing definitely helps, but it's I wouldn't say that it's I wouldn't say that especially a team at scale would be able to get away with only having some automation tests, but not having other forms of technical documentation. I just want to jump in on that one. I'm mostly in agreement with Fergus. There are many ways that this extends out into sort of unit tests and infrastructure as code and various other ways of documenting what you do. I get asked quite often, do I believe in self-documented code, which is a similar sort of fallacy around this. And I don't. I think it's part of a technical documentation ecosystem where there are many ways that you need to use to be able to explain a concept, because that's what in essence we're trying to do. And when we use, for example, BHAT tests for saying this is how a process should work, yes, that's very useful, but there are people that are non-technical that will also need to know how that process works. So it's a tool you use in your toolbox, basically, is my view on this.
Sure. I mean, absolutely, with the code piece, like the clean code is supposed to be, you don't need comments if your code is clean, because you should be able to read it. And obviously, if you're trying to explain a much more overarching approach, you can't purely rely on the quality of your code. So let's move on to... Go ahead,
just,
sorry.
Just to add on that, I also agree that tests and documentation have different purposes. And I mentioned ADRs, and I saw someone pick that up in the comments. So architecture decision records are part of a more general concept called architecture knowledge management, and you can look that up online. They created this concept because testing was not enough, right? That's one answer. But these are documents that highlight the decision-making process that leads to a particular choice of software design, right? And they include something that tests don't necessarily include that visible, which is architecture significant requirements, or ASRs, right? Which are requirements that basically have the most measurable effect on that system's architecture and quality, right? So you have more things that are not visible in code. That's what I wanted to add.
Absolutely. So sticking with you then, how do you go about making documents clear and readable?
Well, I think I mentioned about the format readability already. So the other point is content clarity, right? And content clarity can be achieved by first tailoring the documentation for the relevant audience, right? Is this a monologue? Is this directed to another individual, a team, multiple teams, the entire organization? Is the language used common knowledge or specific terminology, right? Secondly, trim it and prioritize it, right? So write short, clear sentences, order the most important ideas and actions at the top. Add diagrams, flowcharts, images, whatever. Link to other relevant documents, right? I've always asked myself, wouldn't it be nice if the code repository would have the ability to link lines of code with a section in a wiki and a bug tracker? That's my dream. And thirdly, but very important, version it, right? Things change, and make the status of the document very visible. Like, this is work in progress. This needs sign off. This is version 1, version 2, etc. And I have a funny story about versioning technical requirements, right? I worked for a company where the PM changed the requirements in our conference a few days before the release, and then disabled the version history, so the team couldn't see when the changes were made, right? Come release day, and we have a very upset client because we basically delivered something else. And I was the technical lead on that team. Yeah, needless to say, 2 weeks after I left the company, and shortly after, I found out that the rest of the team left. So, moral of the story, don't do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a fair way to do business, does it at all? IO, do you have any other comments around this piece?
Yeah, only a few. I think the biggest one is, touching on Evelina's point, is that there's multiple ways to do this. I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but we've all had times where we've had to explain a technical subject or a system that we've built maybe years ago and is now the only person that knows how it works, and we've needed to be able to do that. And my sort of view is that of a sort of SRE. If I need to do this more than once, I need to automate a way of doing this. So the bit I want to touch on about here is actually video, and how there are different mediums for communicating our technical knowledge, and it doesn't have to be the wiki or the README or the Confluence page. It can be asynchronous. It could be, if you're going to have, for example, a one-to-one catch-up or a team catch-up of, here, let me explain this system. Record it, put it on the web page that you store your documentation with. Keep it there. Keep it up to date. I think Evelina's spot on with versioning control of information, and yeah, like the other part of this is where you store things. So Git is great for documentation if you want it completely version controlled. Most people are going to go, "What are you talking about?" READMEs, even books. There's a friend of mine asked me the other day around what would be a good way of presenting something that's really shareable. They asked me about making a HR framework. I'm like, well, you use the tools the open source community has used, because we have something like Gulp, for example, where it's a small number of people working on it, and yet everybody that's involved in web development knows how to use it, because the sort of tools and processes that community has for sharing knowledge, because at the end of the day, technical documentation is just about sharing knowledge. When you break it down into its component parts, it's about getting what's in your head into somebody else's. And for me, there are multiple ways to do that, and that's more what I wanted to touch upon.
Sure. So essentially, staying with you, IO, so ways to make it easier to get started then. I think you're touching on a few different formats. What would you recommend?
Well, I've probably got the contrarian view here, that I wouldn't start with tools and I wouldn't start with formats. I'd start with process, because actually, when you look at knowledge sharing and technical documentation, they're cultural pieces. So they're dictated by process. They're dictated by what you put up with, in essence. So if you put up with people not documenting their things or letting code go out without unit tests, this is the sort of culture you perpetuate. So for me, it's looking at how is the best way for us to share knowledge as an organization. How do we share it within teams? How do we share it at different levels and make it understandable? That's the starting point. Before you get anywhere near sort of frameworks or tools or responsibilities of individual people, it's about baking it into everything you do. So that's my starting point. Is I wouldn't necessarily make it about anything other than what is a good practice. Now, somebody asked earlier any frameworks you'd use. For me, these are things that are great tools, but just pick one. Just pick one, try it, see if it's working, and then iterate. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a Spotify model. It's not the exact one. We've taken it, tried it, made changes to it, and continually tweaked it and as we moved along. And picking documentation is the same thing. Find a starting point and start to iterate and review and improve as you go along. Sure. That's where I'd start with it.
Excellent. And Fergus, anything else that you'd recommend around getting started?
I mean, I think that they're all excellent points, and definitely to focus on the people side of the problem rather than on the tooling or kind of getting set up as a framework there. I'd maybe add that it's about agreeing as a team what the outcome you're looking for with the documentation should be, and focusing on the impact there, because then you're going to get a lot more empowerment within the team and a lot more buy-in with, especially if they're not necessarily standard practices today, then trying to just kind of enforce it as a new mandate never goes down well. So getting everyone to buy into where the value is there and what what you're hoping to achieve in terms of moving not only the team but the rest of the business forward, then I think that's a strong thing to focus on. In terms of like practical suggestions, then quite literally in this day and age of asynchronous communication anyway, then if someone's hitting you up in a one-to-one Slack message about something that might be useful to the rest of the team, then stick it in a Google Doc, stick it in a Notion page, stick it in an email that the rest of the team or the rest of the organization can then refer back to in the future. And then that means that you're not having to give the same, or God forbid, different responses to the same question to different people as and when they come through. So I think that's a kind of a good place to start. But then also in terms of the actual process side of things, then if we're talking about technical documentation, then with PRs, then quite often there's either a written or unwritten set of items that you'd be looking for in terms of code reviews for every new branch that comes in. So have some agreement within the team as to what you're looking for with new branches that come in, and have a shared understanding that these branches can get pushed back if there's insufficient levels of documentation, or if there's queries about that outside of just the code and the testing and the other functional, non-functional requirements.
Excellent. And while you talk about this, actually staying with you, Fergus, so what are the common anti-patterns and when should you not document? That's actually one of the questions from the audience as well.
Great. So I think when I mentioned a bit earlier about having a read to write ratio, and I think if that ratio starts dropping below 1, where you're writing more documentation that's actually being consumed, then I think that's a pretty good indicator that you're over documenting what the target is. And I guess that's coupled with redundancy or repeated documentation. If you're writing the same thing in Notion, as in Confluence, as in emails, as in Google Docs, as in whatever other tools that you've got going on within the business, then that's a surefire way to end up with out-of-date documentation and people referencing different targets and having essentially multiple sources of truth, which as technologists, I'm sure we're all keen to steer away from. Maybe slightly more contentiously than high flux targets. So if you're prototyping, or if you're kind of very early stage of building something, then there's definitely decision making and being able to follow that narrative through the process, but not kind of exaggerating the levels of documentation, whether that's API documentation or documentation that's targeted for audiences outside of that prototyping team too much, because then that's inevitably you're just going to end up rewriting and not getting the same sort of value as you would if you then like kind of bring that in at a slightly later stage. And then maybe a more subtle one is if the audience, the intended audience, isn't actually just going to read that documentation, and there's a whole bunch of kind of human factors in as part of that as well, in terms of Evelina touched on the style and making documentation easily understandable, easily consumable, but also things like the medium of the documentation. If the intended audience doesn't enjoy consuming information through the tools that you're broadcasting that through, or slightly I've also seen it come down to individuals, and if the specific author is pushing out documentation with a specific style or a specific tone of voice, then sometimes that can get an adverse reaction from the intended audience and the rest of the team.
Okay, great. And Evelina, what would you say to contribute towards anti-patterns and when not to document?
Yeah, I think Fergus covered it really well, but I would add a few points on top. So first point is, don't over document and under commit to maintain those documents, right? So put it in other words, if you write it, you maintain it. And the second point, which is particularly important in an early stage startup, and I have firsthand experience, is don't document when it's time to experiment, right? Don't use documentation as an excuse not to get off your chair and talk to your team, to your users, to your customers, right? You should take the time to prepare experiments, for example, in writing, right? You funnel primary, secondary research, etc. And then at the end, you write the results of the analysis and share it. But in between, you still need to relate to humans, right? Because written communication, however many benefits it has, still lacks the ability to assess, for example, non-verbal cues like tone of voice and body language, and lacks human bonding, right? So what I found useful is sometimes after the written documentation, follow it up with a verbal summary, right? And my third point is, in general, what you don't want to micromanage, don't micro-document, right? And there was another question in the audience about processes, methodologies to figure out principles. And related to this, I like the ISA principles, independent system architectures or software architectures. So you can find them online. It's about writing macro guidelines that all teams share, and then micro guidelines is down to the individuals who are closer to that code to document and maintain, right? So separate this into 2 tiers.
Fantastic. So seeing some of the questions from the audience actually nicely lined up to my follow-up questions soon as well. But we'll kick off with one of mine first, though. So Io, what's the best ways to make the documentation that's created discoverable inside the organization? Thanks,
Glyn. So there's a couple of ways you could do this. Some are better than others. Let's take my least favorite. So that's consistency of storage. So There's a few ways about this, so I'm trying to think how best to structure this. So I worked with an organization a number of years ago where their policy was that everybody in the organization would be taught how to name, how to tag, how to store every document they'd ever write, so that it was searchable. And you had this premise of, because everybody would store it in the same way, everybody would understand the logic used to then be able to navigate it and find what they were looking for. However, when you get this at large scale, very rarely works, because you get more people coming on board than that are brand new, and the people that originally started storing those documents have moved on, and it becomes a maintainability nightmare. So for me, it's more about making knowledge searchable and making technical documentation searchable. And that might be that you have different systems for different things. We've talked about unit tests a bit earlier. That's one facet of this. Making that searchable is still the ultimate goal here. So it's definitely about tagging. It's about ownership, and it's about maintainability of it, because in essence, the biggest part for me around documentation, technical documentation being key and part of culture, is it's up to date and house kept, shall I say. The amount of times people will look for a document and go, well, this is out of date, so I don't know, I'll figure it out as I go along. Unless you keep that sort of culture of housekeeping of documentation, you get into steps where people don't update it. People don't think, oh, this is out of date, I'll put a new page here in place. So it again goes back to culture, but it's also about the right tooling to make it searchable. Because I feel that any structure you put in place where you have to rely on understanding the logic to be able to navigate and traverse either a directory structure, a filing cabinet, a post-it note system, Confluence, any number of different tools, falls down, because we aim for a diverse culture. We aim for a diverse set of people that we want to work with. And therefore the underlying logic of, well, it's alphabetical, so everybody must know it's alphabetical, falls down, and people fall into that trap of, well, where do I store this? And as a result, if you don't have the where do I store this, so for example, you might say all code documentation must be in code and it must be stored in Git. All README documentation must be in Confluence. Unless you go that route, which again is very prescriptive and very time consuming, it comes back to making it searchable. And again, tags, authors, having people accountable for, I have this piece of documentation, as Evelina said, and being able to see what people are looking for to find it is quite key. So in essence, it's like many things in technology world. It's a case of see how it's working, do a retro on it, understand, get the data that says, are people being able to find what they're looking for, and slowly make tweaks and improvements until you get there.
Excellent. So actually something you're touching on there. So my next question is, should you centralize all your documentation or keep it separate? And one of the audience members actually went much further with this. So probably for Evelina. So you got README's, open APIs for APIs, Google Docs for RFCs, ADRs, Google Drive for storing docs, Confluence, Google Sites for wiki. You've got PagerDuty. You've got Datadog for postmortems. I feel at times we have too much documentation in too many places for many different purposes. How do you keep it all together? What works for you? And how do we make sure that people find what they're looking for?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would like to say there is an answer that fits everyone. But let's examine the two options, right? The first one is to keep the documentation next to the code, right? And you can think of it as principle of locality, right? Our brain remembers the last location where we made changes. But like Ayo said, what if, we have 1,000 microservices, each with hundreds of files, and we want to find something quickly, right? Or get an overview of our architecture principles. That's a question to think about. And the second option is to put it in a centralized wiki, right? Something like Confluence, Notion, GitHub Pages, and link it from and to there, right? And in general, my personal preference is for this approach because it's a single source of truth, right? But like Ayo said, unmaintained wikis are where documents go to die. So you have to overcome the inertia of maintaining that documentation fresh, right? You have to overcome this fire and forget mentality. If you don't want your wiki to become a graveyard. And there are no shortcomings than doing the work for that, right? So the way I say it, if you write it, maintain it, right? And I think there might be a third way, something that automatically collects the generated docs from the code base and pushes them into the centralized repo. I don't remember that either was a custom script that we used or something like Gitbook or another tool like that. But there might be a third way.
So I just want to touch upon that. So we at one point trialed using a PHP doc, because a lot of our architecture was PHP at the time. That were if you had your doc blocks properly and your code comments to PHP Fig standard, they would pull them out and put them into a nice README for you. But honestly, again, it goes back to maintainability, because if nobody's updating that code, you just get lots of rubbish. And if you've got a really large code base, it becomes rubbish on top of rubbish. We've all had tools, much as Evelina said, where it's just become a dumping ground and you can never find anything. For me, it comes back to process. Like I favor a centralized approach. I favor everybody being able to have transparency around documentation as well, because you'll increase how many people can edit it, how many people can take ownership of it, how many people can look at it and go, well, that little bit's wrong. I just make this small change. Like if you make it so that many people can do tiny little bits to improve it overall, you'll get much better traction with it. But I think centralized approach works best in my experience, but it's a minefield, because it really, really does depend. And I hate that answer. It depends on your use case and your size. Like if you're a 10-person company, then a Confluence page that you're all sort of looking at is great, because everybody will go, oh, well, that's different. This doesn't work, and it has that cohesion. If you're talking about a 300-person company, then that's where it becomes like a bit of head scratching and a bit of, does this work for us? And that's where you probably do need to start looking at decentralized tools. But if you have the right processes in place that dictate an approach for storage, then maybe you can go centralized. So it really, really does depend. And I know that's a horrible answer for a question like that.
Sure. Fantastic. So I'm just going to Fergus now. So essentially one of the questions from the audience is around, obviously, the contents existed in Slack. Now everyone's working remotely and having discussions with inside Slack channels and threads. How do you document those discussions and decisions that happen all over the place?
Yeah, excellent point. And I mean, the pinning Slack messages only goes so far until you end up with tens, if not hundreds, of pinned messages in a channel. I mean, one on a practical level, then I've definitely seen my teams like kind of referencing back to Slack conversations within documentation. So taking the Slack URL and putting that directly in the technical documentation to contextualize some of the decision making and the write up there. But I think ultimately, then you know, you and the team need to have an understood kind of promotion path from ad hoc conversation into some form of documentation, and trying to make that as low friction as possible is definitely the way to go about that. I mean, to echo Io's point, you know, it will really depend on what the team's comfortable with at the moment, and what sort of tool chain you're using for the various kind of discussion and decision points there. But it's in order to make it searchable, and in order to make it discoverable, and in order to make it really useful, then I haven't found a good way of being able to kind of automatically convert those sorts of Slack conversations into technical documentation, or into long living documentation that goes beyond just the context and the discussion.
What we did at Touco, obviously we're a small startup with Slack, is to have separate channels for different things. So we had a stand-up channel where we linked an app called Olaf, where it was automatically asking every member 3 questions every morning for our stand-ups based on the PPP approach, progress, plan, and problems. And then we had a channel for technical incidents and bugs and stuff that was linked to GitHub and Jira or Notion. So you can try to create some specificity in Slack with some channels. But again, it's not solving this problem at huge scale. One interesting approach, which is taken by a remote all company, GitLab, which has thousands of employees, is called the handbook first approach. And they also have things like remote manifesto. So in that handbook first approach, they explain some of these practices and tools, as well as the benefits and drawbacks of documentation and async communication in general. So I recommend reading that on their blog.
Absolutely. An approach I've done before is always having a free Slack account, so the history is never stored, so people know that it's never going to be there. So anything important does have to then go into documentation if they plan to refer to it later. Okay, then Fergus. So one of obviously the most important pieces is how do you motivate teams to keep the documentation current and keep and improving them as things change?
Yeah, an excellent point, and probably one that we could spend an hour, if not longer, talking about in subsequent conversations. I mean, I think I touched on it earlier, but really aligning the team with the value and the impact and the outcomes that you're expecting to see from the documentation that they're writing and maintaining is I think core to that. And if at the end of the day, if someone on the team who is responsible for writing the documentation doesn't have any line of sight on how that's being consumed and how that's being found useful, then they're not going to be motivated towards keeping that up to date or to going and maintaining that. So whether that's you know, taking more of a kind of quantitative approach as to how you put some kind of metrics around that, or whether it's qualitative in terms of surfacing up the value that others within the team or people outside of the immediate team are getting from that documentation, then I think that's an important feedback loop, because it will also help steer on how to improve documentation over and above just keeping it up to date and keeping it relevant. I think also, as with other non-functional requirements within process and kind of development engineering, then making sure that there's enough breathing room for the team to be able to properly allocate their time and focus towards documenting alongside moving pixels or writing semicolons or whatever the parlance you tend to use internally is, then that's definitely another component that it needs to be managed in terms of expectations from a delivery perspective, that it's not a secondary thought that you have to ship the feature and then you have to come back later and do the documentation, because that's never going to end up being prioritized with the same sort of focus as delivering the user appreciable work. And also dog fooding your documentation and being able to use that documentation yourself within the team. Quite often, people within a specific team will have written some of that code base months, if not years ago, and it's only reasonable that the people within that are working on that code base will need to refer back to the code itself, if not the documentation that surrounds it, and making sure that it's useful for themselves, if not other people. Then I think that's a great motivating factor as well.
Excellent. And Evelina, have you got any additional comments for that?
Yeah, I mean, documenting things in general increases discipline, right? Performance, and leads to high quality work that we can build upon long term, right? And I would like to take credit for saying that, but it's actually the CEO of GitLab who says it. And he makes this comparison of bricks and bricklaying, right? And it's definitely a slow process, no doubt about it. But if you want to build a very high tower, you need to invest some time in the foundation, right? And it needs initiative, it needs collaboration, it needs energy to do so, right? And it's all about how we pitch it, how we pitch that value back to the team, right? We can pitch all the other benefits that we've discussed today. On top of that, I would definitely pitch these surprising benefits of documentation to the well-being at work, right? The things I mentioned before: fairer evaluations, less bias, more empathy, more clarity in decision making, and a repeatable learning process that leads to high quality work, right? And I think it's, at the end of the day, it's our jobs as technical leads, engineering managers, CTOs, to deliver this elevator pitch to the team, right? Let them ask the hard questions like we've been asked today. Let them disagree, but at the end of the day, commit to something and learn, build, measure, learn.
Excellent.
I would say that the assessing documentation based on quantity rather than quality is definitely not a way to motivate the team. So just saying, you need to match the lines of code with the lines of documentation is never going to get you the desired result. So being kind of careful about, if you are tracking KPIs around within the team or within the organization around documentation creation, then being careful that you're not falling foul of vanity metrics or metrics that aren't actually assessing the results and the value that you're creating.
I know we're short on time. I just want to nip in with this one. So I think, Fergus, you really great points. Evelina, really great points. The metrics piece is really interesting to me, because actually the vanity metrics is we can all fall into that trap of measuring that. I think what comes into it is actually your sort of cycle time and lead time stuff, because actually if you start measuring that, you start looking at how do we bring that down. You then start asking the questions of, well, why is it so high? Well, it's high because we don't know what we're doing in this particular area, which shines a light on, well, why don't we know? Why isn't it documented? So you start to get people coming with the answer of, okay, well, we need this to be better documented. So let's do that. You start getting people, as you build metrics around how is it hurting our speed of decision, our speed of delivery, rather than metrics around how many lines is it, what's the length, how many pieces did we document in a month. Those are largely irrelevant. It comes down to when you're making decisions or your speed of delivery. Those metrics matter, because then they ask those important questions. And the other bit I would add is change it up. Documentation is boring. Documentation is not a separate step. So if it's in your Jira flow as this is the time you document, throw that away immediately, because it needs to be part of everything you do. But we gamify occasionally, so we'll have sort of rewards or prizes for documentation that answers or is of good quality. And those are the bits I wanted to add.
Excellent. And as a very quick roundup for everybody then, who should ensure that the organizational memory is being maintained with documenting? Who's responsible for this?
Everyone.
Everyone agrees? Fantastic. All right then, fantastic guys. So it's great having you all with us today. Thank you to Evelina, Fergus and Io for talking with us today. You can connect with our speakers after the event on the links we've just shared. Also next Friday, we've got another CTO Craft Byte event, the case for and against boring technology. So do check that out. So thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.